Storytellers don't just talk about the world, they shape it. The stories we share are like soil. They're living, dynamic, and the kinds of stories we choose to tell determines the kind of world that grows around us. Are you familiar with the term collective imagination? If you're a storyteller, especially one who wants to inspire social change, collective imagination is one of the most important things to be aware of. And you know what? You probably already are, even if you don't know it by that name. Collective imagination are the stories, the ideas, the settings, and the values all shared by a group of people. Whenever you see people from the same background start to tell stories that all hit similar notes or contain the same themes or have these recurring topics that come up over and over, that's what collective imagination looks like. Here's an example of that. Remember maybe like a year or two ago where the idea, the concept of interconnected multiverses was everywhere? Like your best picture was Everything Everywhere All at Once, which was a multiverse movie for sure. And Spider-Man went into the whole thing with multiverses, and so did Loki. And what was happening in the technology space at that same time was the company Meta was developing its own virtual universe, kind of like the one in Ready Player One, where people could have these virtual lives. This was just on the heels of people spending about a year in lockdown, living lives very much on screen, more maybe in the digital space than a physical one. And so there was this great big awareness of multiverses. There's probably a lot of asking what if things had gone differently type questions at that same time too. In the early 70s or in the late 70s or perhaps the early 80s, you would have had something similar to this going on around the theme of artificial intelligence. 2001: A Space Odyssey was probably the most notable film, but you also had Tron and Blade Runner around that same time frame. A lot of Philip K. Dick's novels were written here too, and so now that AI has taken a very concentrated step forward in the past year as far as its development goes, I think we're seeing a bit of a resurgence in AI being a theme of our works of fiction and art. The villain of the newest Mission Impossible movie was AI. And if you think more abstractly, Oppenheimer, like I know that wasn't an AI movie per se, but it is about a time in history where a big leap forward in technology seemed to also bring along a great big risk. So when you have these topics that are just so salient in people's minds, just on the top of people's tongues as far as conversation goes, as a storyteller, that's the field you have to work with. It's like being a surfer. Those are the waves you have to ride. I recently read something that was kind of troubling, but also very believable. People did an analysis of human storytelling across different times, across different cultures, and locations too. And what they found is that nature has never played such a small role in collective imagination as it's playing right now. Of course, this is happening concurrently with the destruction of our natural world being widespread and the way our lifestyles have us very insulated from the natural world. Now, before this point, nature was such an ingrained part of people's lives. There was no escaping it. Most things written prior to the past century featured plot points like big storms or famines, a plague of locusts, or a massive fire. Like people's lives were so much more heavily interdependent with nature, and now, as our lives have gotten more interdependent with technology, that's where the plot points tend to be coming from. So what does this mean for your work as a storyteller? How can collective imagination play a role in your own creativity? I got a few ideas. First of all, I think more often than not, it'll be helpful to be conscious of the collective imagination. Now, I'm not saying that every work you create needs to be a response to the newspaper headlines, unless you're like going to be the next host of The Daily Show or something like that. I actually think that, for the most part, work that is so granularly focused on the exact specific events that are happening right now have a very short shelf life. They're temporary, they almost, have a disposable quality to them. And that's not always a bad thing, though. Sometimes you have art forms like comedy be really about the present moment. And in its own way, that's really cool. But when it comes to my own art, what I'm trying to look for more often is that sweet spot. when things feel both timely and timeless. There are things that come out and tell their own story, and the story is so high quality that it can stand on its own at whatever point in history. But then when you look at it, and you look at the backdrop of when it came out in the world and the conversations that were happening at the time, you can see clearly how it's related. Like the original X-Men comics is probably a great example of this. If you look at them now, if you look at them 20 years ago when the Hugh Jackman and Halle Berry movies were coming out, you see it's an interesting superhero sci-fi about a new chapter in human evolution that's linked to superpowers. But if you look at them in the context of when the comics were being written, what you see is this metaphor for the civil rights era. You see the ideological struggle between Professor X and Magneto kind of representing different approaches to activism and social pressure, and it's very much social commentary that's derived from its specific moment in history, but it's so, it speaks to it at such a high level that it's applicable to tensions and debates that are still happening. It's a brilliant example of a work of art that dances with the collective imagination. It's aware of what's happening, it's responsive, and it offers its own perspectives. It gives us a story that can still be picked up and carried by future generations and future iterations of the same struggle. Now, being aware of the collective imagination sounds like it could be this big, overwhelming thing, especially when you think of things that are in the news lately. It's just like, yeah, who actually wants to do that? But just check in with yourself, is all I'm saying. Like, what questions does it seem like everyone around you seems to be asking? What are some big dots that connect between your own life and the broader world? What are those great big unknowns we're heading to collectively as a culture and as a society? Because you're a part of that too. You know, unknown things can be scary, and it's when you find uncertainty that you find people's legacies being written, and they'll be written around things like hope or fear or optimism or conspiracy. So pay attention to uncertainty and your reaction to it and the reaction of others. All right, now I also want you to think of the collective imagination as something that you dance with. You know, there are times you're gonna step forward and times you're gonna step back. It's a give and take. So what's something from the collective imagination that you're gonna riff on in your own work, and what's an insight and principle that you're gonna put out there, that you're gonna contribute to the broader conversation? When you are riffing, when you are looking at something present in the collective imagination to respond to, I don't think it's as simple and as kind of just on the nose sounding as like skimming through the headlines and then throwing in a reference to Putin somewhere in your work. Now, you know, it's not like a box to check, but what I think is a helpful way to go about is starting with something that you're noticing a lot out there in the world. And it could be a current event. It could be something like a government shutdown. But what is a government shutdown? It's what happens when two opposing parties are unable to reach an agreement or a compromise that keeps the basic functions of a government from happening. And you know who suffers the most when that happens? It's like the everyday people who rely on those functions for their livelihood, right? And so maybe there's room in your work that where that overlays with an experience you've had in your life or someone you know where a more vulnerable person was harmed when two opposing forces were unable to reach some sort of compromise. Maybe that looks like King Kong versus Godzilla. Or maybe it looks like Kramer versus Kramer. And you know, even though you hope the government will be shut down forever, right? We hope so. And eventually today's news headlines will collect dust or whatever. But the feeling of being neglected while a relationship that your well-being depends on falls apart, that's a theme that can carry over to other areas. And then years later, when a whole nother administration goes through a similar process, it feels fresh all over again. Huh. So that's my example on how to draw inspiration from collective imagination. But don't forget, you also influence the collective imagination. The work you are making and putting out there is going to be added to the tally of stories that shape what's on the top of people's minds. Even though nature might be slipping from our collective imagination, it's not a bad time for something like an Avatar to come along and jolt that right up. I'm actually not the biggest Avatar fan, but it does effectively put nature back into the collective imagination a bit, so I have to give it credit for that. Maybe Black Panther. Black Panther did that in a great way. That movie, that franchise, gave a huge jolt to the collective conversation that's happening around decolonization and things that are still cascading off of that. So when it comes to the collective imagination, be aware of what's going on around you, but don't feel like you're exclusively on its receiving end. Collective imagination is what happens when all of us are also contributors to it. Even just the stories we choose to talk about or pay attention to, or tell a friend, hey, like this series was great, you should check it out. That gives it a little boost in the collective consciousness. So I think this is a simple topic. On paper, it doesn't take a whole lot of time to understand what this means, but it's a very valuable one. And hopefully it's something you think about in the context of the work you do. Hopefully this has brought a little clarity to your work and to your process. Creativity is always a dance, and so connect with your dance partner. More often than not, that dance partner is the world around you. Thanks, and we'll talk soon.